Billionaire assaulted his pregnant wife. The trial cost him his company, freedom, and name. The sound was muffled by the Maybach's soundproofing, but Charlotte felt it with perfect clarity, the sharp crack of David's hand against her face. Her head whipped to the side, caramel skin already blooming red beneath his fingers. She clutched her swollen belly instinctively, 7 months of life stirring inside her as if sensing the violence. David withdrew his hand slowly, examining it with the detached interest of someone inspecting a piece of art. A small smear of her blood had transferred to his silk sleeve, burgundy on ivory. He frowned at the stain, his brown eyes reflecting nothing but irritation at the imperfection. "You're bleeding on my suit," he said, his voice carrying that smooth Hispanic accent that had charmed investors and seduced her years ago. Now it just sounded cold. "Hi, and welcome to Lumi's Love Library. This is me, quietly putting my writing out into the world for the first time. I'm 25. I love stories, and I believe words still matter, even when you're not sure who's listening yet. If you're here, even by accident, thank you for giving this story a chance. Let's continue." Charlotte's fingers trembled as they touched her split lip. The taste of copper filled her mouth. The gala had been perfect. She'd smiled for every camera, laughed at every joke, played the role of Mrs. David Garcia with practiced grace. And when she'd politely declined champagne for the fourth time, citing her pregnancy, David had waited exactly 17 minutes before pulling her toward the car. "You made me look weak," he continued, pulling out his pocket square to dab at his sleeve. The gesture was so casual, so practiced. "Telling Victoria Matheson that you were too tired for the after party. Do you know how that reflects on me? David, the baby?" Her voice cracked. Fear and rage warred in her throat. "The baby is fine." He waved his hand dismissively, the same hand that had just struck her. "You're being dramatic. You're always being dramatic." The limo glided through the iron gates of their Bel Air estate, smooth as a boat on still water. Through the tinted windows, Charlotte could see the paparazzi stationed outside, their cameras ready to capture the perfect couple arriving home from another perfect evening. David's publicist had probably tipped them off. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his entire demeanor shifted, shoulders straightening, jaw unclenching. Whatever he saw there mattered more than she did. "Garcia Global just hit 847 a share," he murmured, a smile playing at his lips. "The merger announcement is working." Charlotte stared at him. Her face was throbbing. Her baby was kicking frantically against her ribs, responding to her elevated heart rate. And David was checking stock prices. Something crystallized in that moment, sharp and clear and absolutely unforgivable. "Are you even going to ask if I'm okay?" The words came out barely above a whisper. David looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the calculation in his brown eyes. He was weighing options, measuring risks, deciding how much damage control this would require. "You're fine," he said finally. "You'll put some makeup on it. We have the Children's Hospital charity breakfast in the morning. Wear the Valentino dress, the cream one. It photographs well with your skin tone." The limo stopped at the front entrance. Charlotte could see their housekeeper, Mary Peyton, waiting in the doorway, her kind face creased with concern even from a distance. The woman had worked for the Morris family for 30 years before Charlotte married David. Mary knew. Mary always knew. David's hand closed around Charlotte's wrist, his grip just tight enough to hurt without leaving a mark. He'd perfected that pressure over 2 years of marriage. "We're going to walk in smiling," he said softly. You're going to go upstairs, take something for your nerves, and get some rest. Tomorrow we present a united front. Do you understand? Charlotte nodded. But her other hand was already sliding her phone from her clutch, already pressing record on the voice memo app she'd started keeping 3 months ago. Insurance, she'd told herself, just in case. I understand perfectly, she said. What she understood was this. David Garcia believed his wealth made him untouchable. He believed his perfect public image was armor. He believed she was trapped, a trophy wife from the distinguished Morris family, too proud to admit her mistake, too dependent to leave. He believed wrong. As they stepped out of the limo into the flash of cameras, Charlotte's smile was luminous, and David's arm was gentle around her waist. To the world, they were perfect. To Charlotte, wearing his handprint on her face beneath a mask of foundation she'd apply later, they were done. She just had to survive long enough to prove it. The house was silent when Charlotte finally moved. 3 hours of lying perfectly still in their California king bed, listening to David's breathing even out into sleep. 3 hours of planning, of remembering, of understanding that this was the night everything changed. Her face still ached. She'd managed to convince David she didn't need a doctor. It's just a little swollen, nothing serious. Because the last thing she wanted was more of his staff knowing, more people on his payroll who would attest to whatever story he decided to tell. But her baby wouldn't stop moving, little fists and feet pressing against her from the inside as if trying to fight their way out of the danger. I know, Charlotte whispered, one hand spread across her belly. I know, baby girl. We're leaving. She'd known for 3 weeks what she'd name her daughter, though she'd never told David. Zara. It meant radiance in Arabic, princess in Hebrew. Her daughter would be radiant. Her daughter would be free. Charlotte slid from the bed with practiced silence. She'd become an expert at moving through this house like a ghost. The yoga classes David insisted she take, pregnancy glow is important for photos, had at least taught her how to breathe without sound. She'd hidden a bag in the guest room closet 2 weeks ago, after David had accidentally pushed her into the marble countertop hard enough to bruise her hip. Clothes, documents, the thumb drive with copies of everything she'd managed to photograph from his office safe when he was drunk enough to forget to lock it. David had made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated her intelligence the same way he underestimated everyone who wasn't white and male. He saw a beautiful black woman from a good family and assumed ornamental. He never noticed her Morris family lineage came with a Morris family spine. Mary Peyton was waiting in the kitchen, as Charlotte had known she would be. The older woman took one look at Charlotte's face in the dim light and her hand flew to her mouth. Miss Charlotte. I need to leave, Mary. Tonight. Now. Charlotte's voice was steady. She'd cried herself empty in that bed, listening to her husband sleep peacefully after striking a pregnant woman. There were no tears left, only purpose. Mary didn't ask questions. She simply pulled her car keys from her purse and handed them over. There's a spare phone in the glove compartment. Untraceable. I've been keeping it charged. At Charlotte's startled look, Mary's lined face hardened. I've been with your family since you were born, baby girl. You think I haven't been watching? You think I haven't been waiting for you to wake up? Charlotte's throat tightened, but she forced the emotion down. Later. She could fall apart later. He's going to know you helped me. Let him. Mary's voice was fierce. The Morris family takes care of their own. Your father needs to know his daughter is in danger. Charlotte thought of Hugh Morris, her father, the man who'd built Morris Industries from nothing into an empire that rivaled David's, the man who'd walked her down the aisle 2 years ago with tears in his eyes, believing he was giving his daughter to a good man. She thought of her brother George, who'd never liked David, who'd warned her the charm was too smooth, the smiles too calculated. They'd been right. God, they'd been right. David has security watching the gates, Charlotte said. The cameras. The East Service entrance doesn't have cameras. Mr. Garcia said they ruined the aesthetic of the garden view. Mary's smile was grim. Rich men's vanity. Sometimes it's useful. 15 minutes later, Charlotte was in Mary's 20-year-old Honda, her heart hammering as she waited at the service entrance gate. The security code Mary had given her worked. The gate opened with a quiet hiss. And then, she was through. She was out. Charlotte drove with shaking hands, checking the rear-view mirror every few seconds, expecting to see David's men following her. But the road stayed empty. The night stayed quiet. When she finally pulled into the circular driveway of her childhood home in Hancock Park, she saw lights blazing in every window. Mary must have called ahead. The front door opened before Charlotte even turned off the engine. Hugh Morris stood in the doorway, backlit and solid and safe. Her father. 73 years old and still standing like a sentinel. Charlotte got out of the car on legs that barely held her weight. The adrenaline that had carried her through the escape was draining away, leaving behind the reality of what had happened, what she'd done, what came next. Hugh took 3 steps toward her, then stopped. His face changed when he saw her cheek, the bruise that had darkened to purple in the hours since David's hand had connected with her skin. Sweetheart. His voice broke. That was what did it. Not David's cruelty, not her own fear, but her father's pain at seeing his daughter hurt. Charlotte's knees buckled. Hugh caught her before she fell, his arms strong despite his age, holding her up the way he'd held her up her entire life. I'm so sorry, she sobbed into his shoulder. I'm so sorry, Daddy. I thought I could fix it. I thought if I was just good enough, perfect enough. Shh. No. Hugh's hand cradled the back of her head, careful of her injuries. No, baby girl. None of this is your fault. None of it. George appeared behind them, younger version of their father, his face tight with rage. What did he do? Hugh guided Charlotte inside, one arm still supporting her weight. Call Dr. Reyes. Tell her it's an emergency. Charlotte needs an examination for her and the baby. Then call Melody Freeman. The lawyer? George asked, but he was already pulling out his phone. The best litigator in California, Hugh corrected. His voice had shifted from father to businessman. Cold, strategic, lethal. David Garcia just made the worst mistake of his life. He hurt a Morris, and we're going to make sure he pays for every second of it. Charlotte sank onto the leather couch in her father's study, the same couch where she'd done homework as a child, where she told her parents she was in love with David Garcia, rising star of the tech world. The room smelled like her father's cigars and old books and safety. I recorded him, she said quietly, after he hit me. In the car. He was threatening me about tomorrow's charity breakfast, telling me exactly how to cover the bruises. Hugh and George exchanged a look. George's smile was sharp as a knife. That's my sister, he said. Dr. Reyes arrived within 30 minutes, a family friend who'd delivered both Morris children. She examined Charlotte with gentle hands and grave concern, checking the baby's heartbeat, documenting every injury with clinical precision. "The baby's heart rate is elevated but strong," she said finally. "You were smart to leave when you did. The stress levels you were experiencing could have caused complications." She paused, her dark eyes meeting Charlotte's. "Do you want me to file a report with the police?" Charlotte looked at her father. Hugh nodded once. "Yes. Yes," Charlotte said. "I want it documented. Everything." "Good." Dr. Reyes packed up her equipment. "Then I'll make sure the photographs and medical findings are official. And Charlotte, you're very brave." Charlotte didn't feel brave. She felt exhausted and terrified, and 7 months pregnant with the child of a man who'd struck her hard enough to split her lip. But she nodded anyway. By the time Melody Freeman arrived at 3 a.m., still somehow perfectly composed in a tailored suit, Charlotte had showered, changed into her old college sweatpants, and consumed half a pot of decaf tea. George sat beside her on the couch. Hugh stood by the window, his silhouette rigid with suppressed fury. Melody Freeman was a black woman in her 50s, her natural hair cut close, her eyes sharp behind designer frames. She'd made her name destroying powerful men who thought they were above consequences. She set her briefcase on Hugh's desk and looked at Charlotte. "Show me," she said simply. So Charlotte showed her the recording of David's threats. The photographs she'd taken of previous bruises, the documentation of the times he'd forgotten to let her eat until she nearly fainted, the copies of the NDAs she'd found in his safe, agreements he'd paid other women to sign: Nancy Benjamin, Gail Payne, Tammy McKee. Names Charlotte had memorized, women who'd been erased from David's perfect narrative. Melody listened to everything. When Charlotte finally finished, drained and hoarse, Melody pulled out a legal pad and began writing. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "First, we file a police report. Domestic battery, criminal threatening. We get a restraining order before David realizes you're gone. Second, we freeze his assets. If there are other victims, there's a pattern. If there's a pattern, there's likely financial misconduct covering it up." "You think he's been embezzling?" George leaned forward. "I think David Garcia is smart enough to know NDAs cost money, and I think he's arrogant enough to believe he can take whatever he wants from Garcia Global to fund his secrets." Melody's smile was cold. "We're going to find out, and when we do, we're not just putting him in jail for hitting you, Charlotte. We're taking everything." Charlotte felt something unfold in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but something harder, stronger. "I want him destroyed," she said softly. "Not just punished, destroyed. I want his company, his reputation, his freedom, everything he values more than human life." Melody met her eyes. "Then let's go to war." The sun was rising over Los Angeles when David Garcia's phone rang. He answered it still half asleep, irritated at being woken up before his alarm. Charlotte's side of the bed was empty, but that wasn't unusual anymore. She often couldn't sleep in her third trimester. "Mr. Garcia?" An unfamiliar voice, male, official. "This is Officer Martinez with LAPD. We need you to come down to the station to answer some questions regarding an incident last night." David sat up, suddenly fully awake. "What incident?" "Your wife has filed charges of domestic battery and criminal threatening. We have a restraining order requiring you to stay at least 500 yards from Charlotte Morris Garcia, and we need to discuss." David hung up. His hands were shaking. This was impossible. Charlotte wouldn't. Charlotte couldn't. She had no proof, no witnesses, and even if she tried, Who would believe her over him? He was David Garcia. He was untouchable. He called his lawyer, then his publicist. Then he tried Charlotte's phone. Disconnected. He tried Mary Peyton. No answer. He went downstairs. The house was empty. No Charlotte. No Mary. No note. David Garcia stood in his $20 million mansion and felt the first whisper of genuine fear. Across town, in the Morris family study, Charlotte watched the sun rise through the window. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling Zara move. Active. Alive. Safe. He's going to fight, she said quietly. Let him. Hugh came to stand beside her, his hand on her shoulder. The Morris family doesn't lose, Charlotte, and we sure as hell don't let anyone hurt our children. George was already on his laptop, pulling up information about Garcia Global's board members, looking for weaknesses. Melody was on the phone with her team, mobilizing. Charlotte thought about David waking up to a world that was no longer his to control. About him realizing that the woman he'd underestimated was about to become his nightmare. She smiled. It hurt her split lip, but she didn't care. Then let's show him what it costs, she said, to hit a Morris. The war had begun. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. Charlotte watched it from Melody Freeman's law office, surrounded by walls of legal books and the quiet hum of strategists preparing for war. On the screen, David Garcia looked like a man in agony. His brown hair was artfully disheveled. His designer suit was wrinkled just enough to suggest he'd been up all night searching. His brown eyes glistened with tears that caught the camera lights perfectly. Behind him stood his publicist, his lawyer, and a backdrop that read, "Bring Charlotte home." My wife, David said, his voice breaking on cue, is 7 months pregnant with our daughter. She's been under tremendous stress, and I'm worried she's experiencing a mental health crisis. Charlotte's hand tightened on the armrest. Beside her, George made a sound of disgust. Pregnancy-induced psychosis is a serious condition, David continued, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. The cameras flashed, capturing every moment of his performance. Charlotte hasn't been herself for months. She's been paranoid, emotional, saying things that don't make sense. I should have gotten her help sooner. I blame myself. He's good, Melody said quietly, making notes on her legal pad. I'll give him that. He's very good. On screen, a reporter called out a question. Mr. Garcia, are you saying your wife is mentally unstable? David's face crumpled with what looked like genuine grief. I'm saying she's sick. I'm saying she needs help, not judgment. And I'm begging whoever has influenced her to leave my family to please let her get the medical care she needs. Whoever has influenced her. Charlotte understood the message immediately. He was already building a narrative. She didn't leave because he hurt her. She left because someone, her family probably, had manipulated a mentally fragile pregnant woman. I just want my wife home safely, David said, his voice thick with emotion. Charlotte, if you're watching this, please know that I love you. We can get through this together. Come home. The cameras ate it up. Devoted husband, concerned father-to-be. Man willing to forgive his troubled wife's breakdown. Hugh Morris turned off the television with a sharp click. That lying son of a... Let him talk, Melody interrupted calmly. She looked at Charlotte, her expression unreadable. How are you feeling? Charlotte reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She pressed play on the voice memo from 2 nights ago. David's voice filled the office, cold and clear with no cameras to perform for. You made me look weak, Fix your face. You're bleeding on the silk. This is custom. Do you have any idea what this costs? You're being dramatic. You're always being dramatic. The sound of impact was muffled but unmistakable. Then David again. Smile. And tomorrow morning you're going to apologize to Victoria for your behavior. Do you understand? Melody's smile was sharp as a blade. That's what I thought. Let him dig his hole deeper. Every lie he tells on camera makes our case stronger. George was already on his laptop, pulling up social media reactions. The comments are mixed, about 60% sympathetic to him, 40% suspicious. But that'll change. Charlotte stared at the blank television screen where her husband's face had been moments ago. David was betting everything on the oldest story in the book: the hysterical woman, the rational man, the mental breakdown that explained away inconvenient truths. He'd always underestimated her, always assumed she'd be too ashamed to fight back, too concerned with image to air their private life. "When do we release our statement?" Charlotte asked. Melody checked her watch. "The restraining order was served an hour ago. The criminal complaint will be filed this afternoon. By evening, every news outlet will have a different story to tell." She paused. "Are you ready for that? Once we go public, there's no taking it back." Charlotte thought about David's performance, the manufactured tears, the calculated vulnerability, the way he'd weaponized her pregnancy, turned it into proof of instability rather than evidence of his cruelty. "I'm ready," she said. Her voice was steady. "Let's show them who's really sick." Fred Tyndall didn't look like the kind of man who could dismantle a billion-dollar empire. He was 62, balding, wore reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and had the mild demeanor of someone's favorite uncle. But Melody Freeman called him the best forensic accountant on the West Coast, and when he spread his findings across the conference table 3 days after Charlotte's escape, she understood why. "Garcia Global has been hemorrhaging money for 18 months, Fred said, adjusting his glasses as he pointed to a spreadsheet that looked like a roadmap to hell. Small amounts at first, 10,000 here, 20,000 there. Always coded as legal settlements or consulting fees. Easy to miss in a company turning over $2 billion annually." George leaned forward, his businessman's instincts fully engaged. "How much total?" $12.3 million. Fred turned to another page. All of it funneled through a series of shell companies, 3 in the Caymans, 2 in Panama, 1 in Switzerland. Very sophisticated layering. Whoever set this up knew exactly what they were doing. Charlotte's hand rested on her belly. Zara was quiet today, as if sensing her mother's tension. "Where did the money go?" Fred's expression darkened. "That's where it gets interesting. The final destination is a private account in the Caymans. The account holder is listed as DG Enterprises, LLC. Want to guess who the beneficial owner is?" "David," Charlotte whispered. "David," Fred confirmed. "But here's the thing that should terrify you. 3 weeks ago, he started liquidating assets. The house in Aspen, sold quietly through an LLC. The yacht, listed with a broker in Monaco. His art collection, moved to a secure storage facility with instructions for auction." Hugh Morris's face had gone dangerously still. He was preparing to run. "Not just run," Melody interjected, her voice cold with fury. "Look at the timeline. Fred, show them the last transfer." Fred pulled out another document. 2 days before the gala where he assaulted you, David authorized a transfer of $800,000 from Garcia Global's reserve fund. It was supposed to clear this week. He paused. He also purchased a one-way ticket to Geneva. Departure date? Tomorrow. The room went silent. Charlotte felt ice water flood her veins. He was going to leave. He was going to take the money and disappear. Worse, George said, his voice tight. If he'd drained the company and fled, who do you think the creditors and shareholders would come after? Charlotte understood with sickening clarity. David's plan had never been just to escape. It had been to destroy everything on his way out, including her. She was his wife. In the eyes of the law, she could be held liable for his debts. He would have left her pregnant, alone, and drowning in corporate fraud she knew nothing about. That son of a bitch, Hugh said softly. He was going to frame her. Melody was already on her phone. I'm calling Judge Morrison. We need an emergency order to freeze every asset David Garcia has ever touched. Bank accounts, properties, investments, everything. If he tries to move $1, we'll know about it. Charlotte stared at the spreadsheets covering the table. $12 million stolen from his own company. Secret accounts. Liquidated assets. A one-way ticket to Switzerland. She'd thought the assault in the limo was David's worst crime. She'd been wrong. The assault was impulse, rage, loss of control. This was calculated, premeditated. He'd been planning to abandon her for months, leaving her to face the consequences of his crimes while he lived comfortably overseas with stolen millions. We need to move fast, Fred said. If David realizes we found the paper trail, he could accelerate his timeline. Wire transfers can happen in minutes. Once that money leaves the country, getting it back becomes exponentially harder. How long to freeze the accounts? George asked. Melody checked her watch. Judge Morrison owes me a favor. If I can get her in the next hour, we could have emergency orders by end of day. Charlotte stood up, her hand pressed against her lower back. Zara kicked, hard and insistent. Do it. Freeze everything. I want him trapped. I want him to wake up tomorrow and realize he has nowhere to run. Hugh looked at his daughter with something like pride. What happened to the woman who wanted to keep this quiet for the family name? Charlotte thought about David's press conference, his crocodile tears, his accusations of mental illness, his plan to steal millions and leave her holding the bag. She learned, Charlotte said quietly, that some men mistake mercy for weakness. David thought I'd be too ashamed to fight back. He thought I'd protect his reputation to save my own. Her voice hardened. He was wrong. Melody gathered her files with swift efficiency. Then let's show him what happens when you corner a Morris. The deposition room was deliberately bland. White walls, gray carpet, a table that had witnessed 1,000 confessions and denials. David Garcia sat on one side with his lawyer, Jose Ellis, a man whose hourly rate could fund a small country. David wore a navy suit that cost more than most people's cars, his brown hair perfectly styled, his posture relaxed, confident. He hadn't looked at Charlotte once since entering the room. She sat directly across from him, flanked by Melody Freeman and a junior associate taking notes. Charlotte wore a cream silk blouse that complemented her caramel skin, tailored trousers that accommodated her growing belly, and pinned above her heart. The Morris family crest. A gold lion rampant on a shield of blue. The same crest that hung in her father's office, that appeared on Morris Industries' letterhead, that represented 4 generations of power. David's eyes finally landed on it. Something flickered across his face, gone in an instant. Melody set a stack of documents on the table with a sound like a judge's gavel. Mr. Garcia, thank you for joining us. Let's begin with the night of April 15th, the charity gala. Can you describe what happened after you and your wife left the event? David's smile was practiced, charming. We went home. Charlotte was tired. Pregnancy is exhausting, as I'm sure you understand. He had the audacity to look concerned. I was worried about her even then. Worried enough to strike her in the back of your limousine? The smile didn't falter. I never laid a hand on my wife. Charlotte has been under significant stress. Her memories of that evening are compromised. Jose Ellis cleared his throat. My client has been open about his concerns regarding Mrs. Garcia's mental state. We're not discussing mental state, Melody interrupted coolly. We're discussing facts. She slid a photograph across the table. These are medical photographs taken by Dr. Elena Reyes at 3:47 a.m. on April 16th. Can you explain these bruises on your wife's face? David barely glanced at them. Charlotte has always bruised easily. She could have fallen, bumped into something, while sitting in a moving vehicle? I wouldn't know. I was on my phone, working. I didn't see anything unusual. Charlotte watched him lie with the ease of long practice, his accent smoothed over the falsehoods, making them sound almost reasonable. This was the man investors trusted with billions, the man who'd convinced her father he'd cherish his daughter. Melody pulled out another document. Let's talk about Garcia Global's finances, specifically $12.3 million in unauthorized transfers over 18 months. For the first time, David's confidence cracked. Just slightly. I don't know what you're talking about. Really? Melody's smile was surgical. Because our forensic accountant traced every transaction, shell companies in the Caymans, a private account under DG Enterprises, a one-way ticket to Geneva purchased on April 10th. She leaned forward. Were you planning a vacation, Mr. Garcia? Or were you planning to disappear? Jose Ellis put a hand on David's arm. Don't answer that. But David was no longer listening to his lawyer. His brown eyes had gone cold and sharp. He looked at Charlotte for the first time since sitting down, really looked at her. And she saw the calculation happening. The man who'd hidden his violence behind charm was weighing his options, measuring his escape routes. This is a misunderstanding, he said carefully. Those were legitimate business expenses. Coded as legal settlements to silence the women you assaulted? Melody slid across 3 more documents. NDAs, Nancy Benjamin, Gail Payne, Tammy McKee. We've spoken to them, by the way. They're willing to testify. All of them. The color drained from David's face. Charlotte spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but carrying perfectly in the small room. You thought I'd be too ashamed to fight back, too worried about what people would think, too dependent on you to survive without your money. David stared at her. She watched him really realize, that she wasn't alone. Behind her sat Melody Freeman, who destroyed more powerful men than him. Behind her stood the Morris family, with resources that dwarfed his own. Behind her was an army of lawyers, accountants, investigators, all working to dismantle everything he'd built. You made one mistake, Charlotte continued, touching the Morris crest on her chest. You forgot I was a Morris before I ever became a Garcia, and the Morris family protects its own. David's hands were shaking, actual, visible trembling. Melody gathered her files. We'll continue this another time. But Mr. Garcia, I'd strongly suggest you start telling the truth, because right now, you're facing criminal charges, civil suits, and a very public trial. The only question is how much of your life you lose. They left him sitting there, his perfect facade finally crumbling, and Charlotte didn't look back. The garden behind Melody Freeman's Pasadena office was designed for difficult conversations. High walls blocked out the noise of the city. Jasmine climbed white trellises. A fountain burbled softly in the center. It was the kind of place where secrets could be spoken aloud without fear of being overheard. Charlotte arrived first, 8 months pregnant now, moving carefully in the afternoon heat. She'd been living in her father's house for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of depositions and legal filings and watching David's perfect image crack on national television. 3 weeks of preparing for war. She wasn't prepared for the women who walked into the garden behind Melody. Nancy Benjamin was 52, a white woman with graying blonde hair pulled into a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a faded cardigan despite the warmth. Her hands twisted together nervously as she took in Charlotte's pregnant belly, and something passed across her face. Recognition, maybe. Or grief. Gail Payne was 47, black like Charlotte but darker skinned, her natural hair styled in elegant locks. She carried herself with the careful composure of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. A silver cross hung at her throat. "Nancy Gale," Melody said gently, "this is Charlotte Morris Garcia." Nancy's eyes filled with tears immediately. "Oh, honey, you're so young." Charlotte's throat tightened. She'd known intellectually that David had done this before. The NDAs proved it. But sitting across from actual women whose lives he'd damaged, that was different. That made it real in a way documents couldn't. "How far along are you?" Gail asked quietly. 8 months. Gail's hand went to her own stomach, an unconscious gesture. "I was pregnant too. When he—" She stopped. Started again. 22 years ago, I worked in his father's company. Back when it was still Garcia Industries. David was 25, fresh out of business school, already being groomed to take over. "He seemed so charming," Nancy added, sitting on the garden bench. Her voice was distant, remembering. "Everyone loved him, the golden boy. When I told people what happened, they looked at me like I was crazy. Said I must have misunderstood. That David Garcia would never." "So they paid you?" Charlotte said. Not a question. Nancy nodded. $50,000. Made me sign papers saying I'd never speak about it. Never use David's name. Never work in the industry again. I was 23. It seemed like so much money then. Her laugh was bitter. I didn't know it was the price of my voice. Gail pulled out a worn envelope from her purse. Inside was an NDA, dated 2003, pages yellowed with age. 300,000. More than Nancy because I was pregnant, because the stakes were higher if I talked. They made me sign it in a hospital room 3 days after I miscarried. Her voice cracked. David sent flowers. Can you imagine? White roses with a card that said deepest sympathies. Charlotte felt Zara kick hard against her ribs, as if her daughter could sense the rage flooding through her. How many others are there? At least 5 that we know of, Melody said. Most won't talk. The NDAs are ironclad, the penalties are severe, and David's lawyers have made it very clear what happens to women who break them. She paused. Nancy and Gail are risking everything by being here. Then why are you here? Charlotte asked them directly. Nancy met her eyes. Because I watched your husband cry on television about how worried he is about you. I watched him call you mentally unstable, and I remembered... Her voice broke. I remembered him saying the exact same things about me. 29 years later, and he's still using the same playbook. Because I'm tired, Gail said simply. I'm tired of seeing his face in magazines. Tired of hearing people praise his philanthropy. Tired of knowing he's still out there, still hurting people. And I did nothing to stop him. She looked at Charlotte's belly. You're carrying his child. You can't run away like I did. So someone has to stand up. Someone has to say enough. The three women sat in the garden, connected by violence and silence, and the man who'd stolen pieces of all their lives. Charlotte thought about the decades Nancy and Gail had carried this weight. 29 years, 22 years, heavy, exhausting years of forced quiet. The NDAs, Charlotte said. If you testify, he'll sue you for everything. Let him try, Nancy said. Her hands had stopped shaking. I'm 52 years old. I've spent 29 years afraid of David Garcia. I'm done being afraid. Gail reached across the space between them and took Charlotte's hand. Her grip was warm, solid, real. We do this together, all three of us. He can't silence all of us. Charlotte looked at these women, these survivors, who were willing to break decades of silence to help a stranger, who were willing to face David's lawyers and his money and his rage because it was finally time for the truth. Then let's end him, Charlotte said. In the quiet garden, surrounded by jasmine and the sound of water, three women made a pact. David Garcia's reign was over. They would make sure of it. The Los Angeles Superior Court was a cathedral of justice. High ceilings, marble columns, the Great Seal of California watching over proceedings like an unblinking eye. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Reporters lined the walls, cameras waiting outside for the moment court adjourned. The case had everything the media loved: wealth, violence, a pregnant victim, a powerful man facing consequences, people for David Garcia, the trial of the century. Charlotte sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, 9 months pregnant now, Zara pressing insistently against her ribs as if eager to be born into a world where her father was held accountable. Hugh sat on one side of Charlotte, George on the other. Her armor, her anchors. David sat at the defense table in an immaculate gray suit, his brown hair perfectly styled, his expression one of wounded dignity. He looked like a man falsely accused, bearing his persecution with noble patience. Jose Ellis sat beside him, a silver-haired predator in Armani, already crafting the narrative that would set his client free. The jury filed in. 7 women, 5 men, diverse ages, diverse backgrounds. They would decide everything. The defense may make its opening statement, Judge Patricia Morrison said. Jose Ellis stood with the kind of confidence that came from 40 years of winning. He buttoned his suit jacket and turned to the jury with a sad smile. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a marriage that fell apart. A young woman from a powerful family who married a successful Hispanic businessman, then realized she wanted more than love. She wanted his fortune. He gestured toward Charlotte. Charlotte Morris comes from money. The Morris family is worth billions. But David Garcia? He built his empire from nothing. His father was an immigrant. David earned every dollar through hard work and sacrifice. Charlotte's jaw clenched. The narrative was already twisting. Now, Mrs. Garcia sits before you, claiming abuse. But where's the proof? A recording made secretly, in which you'll hear a man frustrated with his wife's behavior. Not violence, but exasperation. Medical photographs that could have come from anywhere, and a convenient escape to her wealthy family, who stood to benefit enormously from destroying David Garcia's reputation and taking control of his company. Melody Freeman rose smoothly for the prosecution. She wore a deep burgundy suit that commanded attention without demanding it. Mr. Ellis paints an interesting picture, but pictures lie. Evidence doesn't. She pressed a button and the courtroom screens lit up with a photograph of Charlotte's face, the bruise purple-black against her caramel skin, her lips split and swollen. This is what Mr. Garcia's exasperation looks like. This is what happens when a man who believes his wealth makes him untouchable loses control. The jury leaned forward, studying the image. Over the next 3 days, they heard testimony. Dr. Elena Reyes described Charlotte's injuries in clinical detail. The housekeeper, Mary Peyton, testified about the sounds she'd heard coming from the couple's bedroom, the way Charlotte had started wearing long sleeves in summer. A security guard admitted David had ordered him to delete footage from certain cameras on certain nights. But it was Ray Janes who changed everything. The former pilot was 61, weathered and uncomfortable in his suit. He'd flown David's private jet for 7 years before quitting abruptly 3 months ago. He took the stand with visible reluctance, avoiding David's gaze. "Mr. Janes," Melody said gently, "you flew Mr. Garcia to various locations during your employment?" "Yes, ma'am." "And Mrs. Garcia sometimes accompanied him?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you describe a flight in January of this year?" "January 14th, from Los Angeles to Aspen." Ray Janes's hands gripped the witness stand. "We were about an hour into the flight. I was in the cockpit with my co-pilot. We heard..." He stopped, swallowed hard. "We heard screaming from the cabin." The courtroom went silent. "What kind of screaming?" Melody asked. "A woman, Mrs. Garcia. She was crying, begging someone to stop. Then we heard crashes, things breaking, more screaming." His voice shook. "I called back on the intercom to ask if everything was all right. Mr. Garcia answered. Said his wife was having a panic attack and to mind my own business." "What did you do?" "Nothing." Ray's face crumpled with shame. "I did nothing. When we landed, Mrs. Garcia came out of the cabin wearing sunglasses even though it was snowing. Her hands were shaking. She had bruises on her wrists." He finally looked at David. "I knew. I knew what he'd done, and I said nothing because he paid me $200,000 a year." Jose Ellis cross-examined aggressively, suggesting Ray had been fired for incompetence, that he was lying for revenge. But the damage was done. The jury had seen a grown man cry with guilt over his silence. Nancy Benjamin testified next, then Gail Payne. 2 women separated by decades, telling identical stories about the same man, the same charm, the same violence, the same threats, the same NDAs buying their silence. David watched his past parade across the witness stand, his expression growing tighter with each revelation. Charlotte watched him watch them and felt Zara kick. Her daughter would be born into a different world. A world where David Garcia's name meant something else entirely. The trial was far from over, but Charlotte could feel the tide turning. The jury was listening. Finally, people were listening. The trial was in its 3rd week when Garcia Global's stock price began its freefall. It started slowly, a 5% drop after Nancy Benjamin's testimony, another 8% after Ray Janes described the screams on the private jet. But when footage of Gail Payne breaking down on the witness stand went viral, when Mauhasis believed survivors started trending with David Garcia's face attached to it, the bottom dropped out completely. 42% in 3 days. Charlotte watched it happen from the courtroom, her phone buzzing with updates from George, who was monitoring the markets in real time. Investors were fleeing, board members were getting nervous. David's carefully constructed empire was cracking under the weight of truth. Porter Edwards called an emergency board meeting on a Thursday morning. He was David's COO, a white man in his 50s who'd built his career in David's shadow. He'd always struck Charlotte as a yes man, someone who'd go along to get along. But standing in the Garcia Global boardroom with 17 board members staring at projected losses in the hundreds of millions, Porter found his spine. "We have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. "David Garcia's criminal trial is destroying this company. Every day he remains CEO, we lose value, we lose clients, we lose credibility." "He hasn't been convicted," someone argued weakly. "He doesn't need to be convicted for us to act." Porter pulled up slides showing the damage. Stock prices, client withdrawals, the Morgan Stanley account pulling $300 million in investments. The evidence presented in court shows a pattern of violence, fraud, and embezzlement. Even if he's somehow acquitted on the criminal charges, the civil liability alone could bankrupt this company. An older woman, Rebecca Chen, one of the board's few independent members, leaned forward. "What are you proposing?" "Termination for cause, immediate removal as CEO, a complete audit of all company finances, distance ourselves from David Garcia before there's nothing left to save." The vote took 11 minutes, 15 in favor, 2 abstentions, 0 opposed. Porter drafted the termination letter himself. The next morning, Charlotte sat in the courtroom watching Jose Ellis cross-examine Fred Tyndall about the offshore accounts. David was taking notes, still playing the role of the engaged defendant helping his lawyer build his defense. He didn't see the man approaching until it was too late. The process server was professional and quiet. He leaned down, murmured something to Jose Ellis, and placed a thick envelope on the defense table. Jose's face went white as he opened it and scanned the contents. "Your Honor," Jose said, his voice strained. "May we have a brief recess?" Judge Morrison frowned. "We're in the middle of testimony, Mr. Ellis." "Your Honor, this is urgent. My client has just been—" He stopped, seeming to realize how this would sound. "5 minutes, please." The judge granted it reluctantly. The jury filed out. David grabbed the envelope, his brown eyes scanning the pages with growing horror. Notice of termination for cause. Charlotte watched him read it. Watched him understand that while he'd been fighting for his freedom, he'd lost his company. The board had voted unanimously to remove him. Garcia Global was stripping his name from the building, from the letterhead, from everything he'd built. "This is Charlotte's doing," David hissed at Jose, loud enough for Charlotte to hear. "Her family is behind this. They're stealing my company." "They're not stealing anything," Jose said tiredly. "The board acted independently. They have that right when the CEO is under criminal indictment for embezzlement." David's hands were shaking as he held the termination letter. Not with fear this time, with rage. Pure, incandescent rage at watching his empire crumble while he sat powerless in a courtroom. He turned and looked directly at Charlotte for the first time in days. She met his gaze steadily, one hand resting on her belly where Zara was kicking. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. Just looked at him with the calm certainty of someone who'd promised to take everything and was keeping that promise. The jury filed back in. Fred Tyndall returned to the witness stand. The trial continued. But everyone in that courtroom knew something fundamental had shifted. David Garcia wasn't just facing prison anymore. He was facing complete annihilation, His company was gone. His reputation was destroyed. His money was frozen by court order. And Charlotte Morris sat in the gallery, 9 months pregnant, watching justice slowly grind him into dust. By market close that day, Garcia Global had dropped another 15%. By the end of the week, Porter Edwards announced the company would be rebranding. The Garcia name was being removed from everything. 23 years of building an empire, gone in 3 weeks. Charlotte's father squeezed her hand as they left the courthouse, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing. "How does it feel?" Hugh asked quietly. Charlotte thought about the woman who'd left that gala in a limousine 3 months ago, bleeding and terrified. Thought about all the years she'd stayed silent, thinking she had to protect David's image to protect herself. "It feels," she said softly, "like the beginning of the end." The jury had been deliberating for 4 days. 4 days of Charlotte pacing her father's house, unable to sleep, unable to eat, feeling Zara press against her ribs as if the baby could sense her mother's anxiety. 4 days of checking her phone obsessively, waiting for the call that would change everything. It came on a Tuesday morning at 10:37 a.m. "They have a verdict," Melody said. "We need to be in court in an hour." Charlotte's water broke 20 minutes later. She stood in her childhood bedroom, feeling the warm rush down her legs, and started laughing. Actual, slightly hysterical laughter. Of course her daughter would choose this moment to arrive. Zara had impeccable timing. "Absolutely not," Dr. Reyes said when Charlotte called her. "You are not going to court. You're going to the hospital, now." "The contractions are 15 minutes apart," Charlotte argued, already pulling on a loose dress. "I have time. I need to be there. I need to see his face when they read the verdict." "Charlotte, I carried her for 9 months while fighting for both our lives. She can wait 3 more hours to meet the world." Charlotte's voice was steel. "I'm going to court." Hugh drove while George called ahead to make sure the courthouse had a wheelchair ready. Charlotte sat in the back seat, breathing through contractions, one hand on her belly and the other clutching her phone with the recording that had started everything. She carried it with her every day of the trial, her insurance policy, her proof, her truth. The courthouse was surrounded by media trucks. News helicopters circled overhead. People vs. Garcia had captivated the nation. Wealth, violence, justice, the question of whether powerful men could truly be held accountable. The verdict would be announced live. The world was watching. Charlotte walked into the courtroom at 11:54 a.m., 6 minutes before the jury was scheduled to return. She refused the wheelchair, walked on her own 2 feet, past the reporters, past the spectators, past David Garcia sitting at the defense table looking like he'd aged 10 years in 4 weeks. He saw her, and his eyes widened. She was in active labor, and she'd still shown up. The realization crossed his face. Charlotte Morris was going to witness his destruction no matter what it cost her. She sat between her father and brother, breathing through another contraction. 12 minutes apart now. Zara was coming, but not yet. Not quite yet. Judge Morrison entered. "All rise." The jury filed in, faces carefully neutral. Charlotte studied them, trying to read the verdict in their expressions. The forewoman was a black woman in her 60s who'd watched every minute of testimony with fierce attention. She held a folded piece of paper. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Morrison asked. "We have, Your Honor." The courtroom held its breath. Charlotte felt Zara kick, hard and insistent. "Almost there, baby girl," she thought. almost. In the case of People versus David Garcia, on the charge of domestic battery causing bodily injury to a pregnant woman, how do you find? Guilty. The word landed like a hammer. David's head snapped up. Jose Ellis closed his eyes. On the charge of criminal threatening? Guilty. On the charge of embezzlement in excess of $10 million? Guilty. On the charge of witness intimidation? Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud? Guilty. 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 5 counts. 5 convictions. Each one a nail in the coffin of David Garcia's freedom. Charlotte felt tears streaming down her face. She hadn't realized she was crying. Hugh's arm came around her shoulders. George gripped her hand. In the gallery behind them, Nancy Benjamin sobbed openly. Gail Payne sat with her head bowed, shoulders shaking. David stood motionless, his face drained of color. For the first time since Charlotte had known him, he looked small, powerless, human. Judge Morrison set sentencing for 2 weeks later, but everyone knew what was coming. The charges carried a combined maximum of 25 years. David Garcia would be an old man when he walked free. If he walked free. Charlotte stood to leave and gasped as another contraction hit. Stronger this time. 8 minutes. She needed to get to the hospital. Now. Charlotte? Melody was beside her, concerned. I'm fine. I just need... Another contraction. 6 minutes. Hospital? Now. The media got their perfect shot. Charlotte Morris, 9 months pregnant, being helped from the courthouse minutes after her abuser was convicted. Hugh on one side, George on the other, Melody clearing a path. The image would run on every news channel for weeks. The pregnant woman who'd taken down a billionaire. Zara Morris was born at 4:47 p.m., 7 pounds and 3 ounces of furious, beautiful life. She came into the world screaming, her tiny fists clenched, fighting from her first breath. Charlotte held her daughter and felt something break open in her chest. Not pain, the opposite of pain, freedom. She's perfect, Dr. Reyes said, smiling. Absolutely perfect. Charlotte looked at her daughter's face, caramel skin like her mother's, dark eyes that would probably turn brown like her father's, a shock of black hair. She was a Morris through and through, but she carried Garcia genes too. That was undeniable biology, but she would never carry his name, never carry his violence, never know what it felt like to be small and scared and trapped. Zara Morris, Charlotte whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. You're free. You'll always be free. Hugh stood in the doorway, tears streaming down his weathered face. George beside him, grinning like a fool. Melody arrived an hour later with flowers and the news that David's sentencing was scheduled. 2 weeks later, Charlotte stood in that same courtroom, Zara sleeping in her arms, and watched David Garcia receive 20 years in federal prison, no bail, no appeal that would likely succeed, 20 years of his life exchanged for the lives he damaged. He looked at Charlotte as they led him away in handcuffs. She met his gaze steadily, her daughter held close. She wanted him to see, wanted him to understand that everything he'd tried to destroy was standing there, alive and strong and victorious. Then he was gone, removed from the courtroom, removed from freedom, removed from her life. 6 months later, Charlotte stood on Wilshire Boulevard on a crisp November morning, Zara bundled in her arms, and looked up at the building that used to be Garcia Global headquarters. The massive letters that had spelled Garcia in steel and glass were gone. In their place, new signage gleamed in the morning sun. Morris and Associates. Her father's company had acquired Garcia Global for pennies on the dollar after David's conviction. Porter Edwards stayed on as COO, leading the restructuring. The company would survive, but under new management, new ethics, a new name. Your grandfather built this city, Charlotte told Zara, who was watching the world with wide, curious eyes. And your great-grandfather before him. Now it's our turn. Hugh joined them on the sidewalk, coffee in hand. Strange to see our name on his building. Not his anymore, Charlotte said. It never really was. He just borrowed it for a while. George pulled up in his car, window rolling down. Board meeting in an hour. You ready? Charlotte Morris had been named to the board of directors. At 29, she was the youngest member. She'd also started consulting with organizations that helped domestic violence survivors navigate divorce and legal proceedings. She understood now that her privilege, her family's wealth and connections, had given her resources most women didn't have. She wanted to change that. Nancy Benjamin worked with her now. So did Gail Payne. 3 women who'd survived David Garcia, now helping others survive their own monsters. I'm ready, Charlotte said. She kissed Zara's forehead and walked toward the building. Her building now, in a way. Her family's legacy. She'd fought for the right to walk through these doors without fear. Inside, the lobby had been completely renovated. Gone were David's pretentious abstract sculptures and the massive portrait of himself that had dominated the entrance. In their place, a simple wall of text. True strength is not in what we take, but in what we give. Not in who we break, but in who we help rise. Charlotte had chosen those words. They felt true in a way David's vision never had. Upstairs, in the conference room, Porter Edwards was waiting with financial reports and restructuring plans. The company was healing, slowly but surely. Clients were returning. Stock prices were stabilizing. It turned out that Garcia Global could survive without Garcia. Thrive, even. Charlotte took her seat at the table, Zara in her arms, and listened to Porter outline their progress. Halfway through, Zara started fussing. Charlotte excused herself to a private office to nurse her daughter, looking out at the Los Angeles skyline. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, trapped in a limousine, bleeding, terrified, believing she had to endure to survive. She thought about all the choices that had led her here, the choice to record David's threats, the choice to run, the choice to fight instead of hiding, the choice to believe she deserved better than what he'd given her. Zara finished nursing and looked up at her mother with those serious dark eyes. She was 6 months old and already strong, already fierce. She grabbed Charlotte's finger and held on tight. You'll never know him, Charlotte told her daughter. You'll know stories, someday. You'll know the truth. But you'll never know his violence. You'll only know that your mother was strong enough to protect you, that your family loved you enough to fight for you, that you come from survivors. Zara made a small cooing sound as if she understood. Charlotte returned to the board meeting, contributed to the discussion, voted on motions. When it ended, she walked out of the building that no longer bore David Garcia's name and into the California sunshine. Her phone buzzed, a text from Melody. David's appeal was denied. It's over. Charlotte looked down at Zara, who was watching the world with wonder. Her daughter would grow up in a world where her father was in prison for his crimes, where powerful men could be held accountable, where women like Charlotte, Nancy, and Gail had spoken their truth and been believed. It wasn't perfect justice. Nothing could give back the years of fear and pain. but it was something. It was enough. "Come on, baby girl," Charlotte said, kissing Zara's cheek. "Let's go home." She walked away from Morris and Associates, away from the ghost of Garcia Global, away from everything David had tried to make her. She walked toward the life she'd built from the ashes of his violence, toward freedom, toward healing, toward the future where her daughter would know only strength. The name on the building had changed, but more importantly, so had Charlotte. She was no longer the woman who'd stayed silent to keep the peace. She was the woman who'd burned it all down to find justice, and that made all the difference. If you enjoyed this story, you're welcome to stay. Subscribe to Lumi's Love Library for new stories every day. And if you're not ready to leave yet, there's another story waiting for you in the playlist on your screen right now.